We are joined today by Maria Battista, Republican for Pennsylvania Superior Court. Why are you running for this office?
You know, the courts are very important to our everyday lives. And back in 2009 and 10, I was putting on legal symposiums about women in the courts and about what happened in the Cash for Kids scandal in Luzerne County. And one of my judges, retired judges on my panel was Madame Justice Sandra Schultz Newman, and she said, Maria, why aren't you running for judge? You care about the courts, you care about people, you want to make sure that the courts are the protectors of not just children, but for all people. And so literally for the last 15, 16 years, I've been working towards having that opportunity. And I think that I'm one of those individuals that people can trust, and they want integrity in the people that are elected to these courts, and I believe I'm one of those people.
How does the Superior Court fit into Pennsylvania's legal system?
You know, we have many types of courts in our Commonwealth, people that are most familiar with the Court of Common Pleas in their own counties. But if you appeal a matter from your Court of Common Pleas, if it's a criminal case, those go up to the Superior Court. Civil cases also go up to the Superior Court. And the sister appellate court is the Commonwealth Court, which hears matters that are related to the government and election law cases. So most people are familiar with cases that they might hear about families, right? Children, child custody, maybe a property settlement in divorce. Someone gets injured, and so that matter, if they believe that there's been some error in the court below, it may be appealed then to the Superior Court. So people don't necessarily think that these courts affect them every single day because they may not be the party that the case is brought before the Superior Court, but the decisions of the Superior Court are very, very important. You know, it's one of the busiest courts in this nation, and about 97% of the cases, approximately, stay in the Superior Court. So they never get to the Supreme Court, our highest court.
How many judges sit on the Superior Court in Pennsylvania?
There are 15. Right now there's a vacancy, and that's why we have different candidates running for this position right now.
What does it take, in your opinion, to be a good judge?
There are many qualities of a good judge, and everyone has a different opinion. But you know, you have to have had, you know, significant experience with the law, but you also have to be an independent thinker. You have to have common sense. You have to be ethical. You have to have, you know, it's good if you had the opportunity to give back in order to teach in some of these types of areas, and I've done that as well. I've taught continuing legal education courses to other attorneys. You also want to be fair. You want to be impartial. You know, when you hear about judges, and sometimes you hear, oh, they've legislated from the bench. You know, there are 3 branches of government for a reason. And, you know, you have senators and you have representatives that are people elect, you know, during the correct cycles in our political process. And they are the individuals who make the laws. They propose bills. If those bills get out of the House and the Senate, they'll go up to the governor, and the governor either can enact that by signing it into law or it's vetoed. The judge is a different branch of government. You know, you're evaluating facts of a case based on the law that's been issued by those bodies in the legislative branch. And so it's very important that we have a separation of powers, and the role of the judge is not to make new law, it's to evaluate the law that's on the books based on the facts of the case, and if there's a constitutional issue, you must address it as well.
What would be your judicial philosophy for hearing a case?
Well, you know, judicial philosophy usually goes to who do you align yourself with? And I really believe that Justice Scalia is really who I would align myself with, more towards originalist, that the Constitution as written, it's not a living document, but that is dealing with the constitutional issues. When you're talking about, when you're evaluating a case, people do not want a person that's going to have a predisposition going into a case and decide, well, this is what my personal preferences are, so this is what the outcome of the case is going to be. No, your personal preferences have no place in the courtroom or in a case. I try to explain it to people like, if you go to an emergency room and you need care, does a doctor or a nurse ever ask you, oh, by the way, what's your political affiliation? when you're a judge for all people. It should be equal justice under the law and justice for all. Even though we as candidates must run, with a political party, we are a judge for all people. And I think that's what people want to make sure. When I was running for this position 2 years ago, I was at a diner in the morning, and I was actually meeting with some law enforcement officers. But as I was leaving, there was a table a little bit larger than the one that we're at this morning. And there was, sometimes you see people that are retired that get together, whether they're men or women. And in this case, it was a bunch of men that were there. And I just introduced myself, let them know that I was running for Superior Court. And I said, by the way, what is it that you look for in a judge? And there was total silence. And the one gentleman looked up and said, no one's ever asked us that question. And they paused, and he said, is it so hard to ask that a judge is fair, that they're impartial, and that they keep politics out of the courtroom? And sometimes we're seeing that once in a while politics happen to get into the courtroom and there's no business for it. That is a different branch of government. You want politics, you should go into become a lobbyist, deal with the legislators where the laws are made.
Let's talk a bit about your history. Where were you born and where did you grow up?
I was born in Ridgeway, which is Elk County, and I've always grown up in Clarion County. It's a very rural area, but my career has truly spanned the entire Commonwealth.
I know you mentioned being a lawyer and an educator. What are some relevant experience that you would bring to the role of judge?
Well, in particular for the Superior Court, my career started in 1993 as a lawyer. And I started in Crawford County with a firm called Culbertson, Weiss, Troma and Shog, which no longer exists. It's now part of a larger firm called Steptoe Johnson. And I was doing insurance defense work. I was doing business law. And then I opened up my own office. And so people are familiar in communities when there's a general practice that you do a variety of types of cases. So I was doing a very large civil practice all through the 90s. So I was doing your real estate, oil and gas issues, your family law issues, your business law issues, estates and wills, child custody, adoption, all those types of cases that would go before the Superior Court. It wasn't until later in the early 2000s that I became an assistant district attorney. And so I was doing all criminal cases. And again, those are the types of cases that go to the Superior Court. In fact, the largest body of law that goes to the Superior Court are criminal cases. The second largest body is family law. And then you have all of these other types of cases. Now, obviously, we don't do everything that goes to the Superior Court, but I've touched on many of them. And then I had the opportunity later in my career to also serve in 2 administrations, initially under Governor Corbett, where I was an attorney in the Department of Health. And I oversaw everything from the licensing of home care agencies, home health care agencies, hospices, birth centers, dialysis centers, as well as the Drug, Device, and Cosmetic Act. And under that act, I was working in joint jurisdiction with the Office of Attorney General, healthcare section. Again, it was all focused on public protection and ensuring that, our communities and our people are safe. Then I had the opportunity, in 2014, to go over to the Department of State. And there I served as a hearing examiner for over 3 years, and I issued hundreds of decisions. Now, that type of law is different than the civil and criminal. It's administrative law. And those cases, if appealed, would go to the Commonwealth Court. But the types of skills that I had, we had hearings. We had witnesses coming before us. We had a prosecutor. We had usually attorneys, sometimes people were unrepresented, on matters where there was testimony. There was experts in different cases. I had to evaluate the evidence, the credibility of the witnesses, evaluate the law, evaluate if there is a constitutional issue, and it's not very often, but there is at times, and then issue these decisions. And then if they're ultimately appealed to one of the appellate courts, those would have gone to the Commonwealth Court. But the skills that I used for over 3 years are the types of skills that you want in a judge of any appellate court or a court of common pleas.
What drew you to law in the first place?
You know, that's an interesting question. On my mother's side, we do have a number of lawyers and doctors, and I really was never exposed to the law even and through them. It was when I was in undergrad, I joined the debate team at Clarion University, where my father was a professor. And to my amazement at the time, you know, you're very young, I know you're a late teenager, and I was doing really well. And it's like, wow, I can do this. And so, you know, I was getting these speaker awards and traveling across the United States, and I was competing with people from West Point and, you know, some of the larger schools. And here I am, you know, from a state school, which is a great education system, but you have an impression because you're from a smaller area that maybe you don't match up to some people in some of the larger areas, and it wasn't the case. I was doing very well, and I even became the state champion in persuasion. So not only was I doing the debate and had a teammate, and we were arguing issues, but I was also then starting to do the prose and terp and the persuasion of informative speaking. And I was meeting other students my age that were going to law school. And I really think there was a few students that I met from William and Mary, some from West Point and others that said, Maria, why aren't you going to law school? And that was really like an aha moment. And it's like, yeah, why aren't I even considering this? And that really was how it all started.
You mentioned serving as counsel for the Departments of Health and State, and you talked about, you know, nursing homes. What are some cases that you would have to hear involving nursing homes or dialysis centers, like you mentioned?
Well, I didn't do the nursing homes. I was doing home care, home health care, and hospices. Yes. Nursing homes was another lawyer, as was hospitals was another. But what happens when you are dealing with facility licensure? So what happens is you have someone that might go and inspect those facilities to make sure they're compliant, whether there's plans of cares being followed, whether the different things in the facility meet the requirements of the Department of Health. And if they do not, then I have to evaluate those cases. It could be even as simple as a case dealing with a CNA that they did not follow the appropriate plan of care. So say, for example, that a patient needed to use the restroom and they needed a mechanical lift and they needed 2 people to help that person to get safely to the restroom. But given types of things that are going on, in, you know, sometimes when there's shortage of providers within a facility, that person is required to follow the plan of care, do not use the mechanical lift, but sometimes they deviate because they feel that they have to give patient care because they can't get the help. But again, that would be considered a violation, and then we have to evaluate that case. Again, it just depends on what it is. A home care agency, you could have a provider that goes into the home of someone and then not only giving the care to the person, what if they take their credit card? What if they take a piece of jewelry? What if they're not giving the medication appropriately? Those attorneys, when they would be evaluating those cases. And if it's also someone taking something, there also might be an underlying criminal matter that would be handled in that particular county. So it really varies quite a bit.
What's it like going from an advocate to an impartial judge, potentially?
You know, that's a wonderful question. I was talking to another candidate recently, and I said, you know, people talk about a judge and what is their judicial temperament. And when you're a prosecutor, when you are a litigator, when you are in a role where you're advocating for one side versus another, even in civil matters, you know, you are trying to persuade whoever it is you're appearing before, whether it's a judge, appellate court judge, a justice, or a hearing examiner, a hearing officer, administrative law judge, why your position is appropriate and why your client or the Commonwealth, if you're representing the Commonwealth, their position is appropriate and that you can meet the elements or not, depending on what that burden is. And where you're a judge, you're not forming any opinions in advance. You're looking at the law, you're listening to what they have to say. And in the appellate level, it's a little bit different. You know, there's a big difference in some areas between the Commonwealth and Superior Court. We both, there are cases that are brought up on appeal, but in the Superior Court, almost everything is based on the record below, the evidence, the transcripts. And if you have a case that has oral arguments, then you're listening to the attorneys in those cases, you know, for that period of time, and you ask questions. So if you don't get an answer or you're not clear on something from the record, that gives you that extra opportunity to ask them to explain how this case differentiates from this one, and how does it apply to the facts in this particular matter? Why should we consider it in this case? Where in the Commonwealth Court, there may be times when there's original jurisdiction where they actually get to hear the witnesses. They actually have that original jurisdiction where they're evaluating something similar to a court of common pleas. Not every case, but there's a unique difference. And so when you're saying, what's the difference between an advocate and a judge? An advocate is focusing solely on their client or the Commonwealth or who they're representing for their side of the case, whereas a judge, regardless of the court, you have to keep an open mind. You have to not make those decisions till you've heard all the evidence or evaluated the evidence and you've looked at the law. And sometimes when you're an advocate, you try to skew the law in a certain way and you take parts of a piece of law or a case, whereas as a judge, and sometimes with the assistance of your law clerks, you say, I want to read the whole case because I don't believe this is what the case actually came down on. So you have to be very, very careful.
The Pennsylvania Commonwealth Court also has an open seat this election. Why did you choose to run for Superior Court?
You know, I'm equally qualified for both, and I love both courts. And I ran for the Superior Court last time, and as I was preparing for this run, you know, I let people know that I was running for Superior Court. It's a very important court, and I have a few things extra to offer, I believe, in the Superior Court. They're my skill sets. They're strong in both, but I have things that are not required by the Superior Court, but I believe helps me if I should be elected by the people for this position. And you know, my background is very diverse, both in education and law. And we always talk about what are your experiences in law. But my background in education is also very important. So I have 5 degrees. 3 are in education. I have an elementary ed degree, I have a master's in education, and I have a doctorate in education. Is that required to be a judge on the Superior Court? Of course not. But does that give me additional knowledge and information that I can help, you know, educate judges in that court? Absolutely. You're dealing with family matters, which is, like I said before, is the second largest body of law. You know, I taught in the K through 12 setting. I've dealt with children. I understand children that have disabilities. I understand the family issues that might impact an educational decision. I understand when you're looking at the best interest of the child, what if someone appealed a case in a child custody case or adoption case, and you believe that the judge in the court below made a decision that you felt wasn't appropriate, and maybe there was an abuse of discretion, and so they appeal it because they believe these factors were not considered appropriately in what the best interest of that child was. And so when you're looking and evaluating what they said is the issue brought before the Superior Court, maybe it does have that extra component. And I have that extra understanding and knowledge and worldview that I can bring to the court, because that's the second largest body of law to the Superior Court. You know, the other thing is I have taken the time over the last 15 years, and we're talking about, like I said, the courts as protectors of children. I traveled on my own dime for almost 8 months, went to the Interbranch Commission hearings. I talked to the special master, Judge Grimm, who was evaluating those 5,000 cases when those 2 judges were put in jail. Again, it involved the children, the juvenile justice system. Those types of cases would go to the Superior Court. And, you know, it's something that I haven't been taken lightly. I was not recruited to run. It's something that I've been doing for a very, very long time, and I take it seriously. I have the integrity. I have the belief that I'm the type of person that people want on this court. They want someone they can relate to, that they can trust, that's not going to be persuaded one way or the other, and is going to do the right thing every single time.
What makes you stand out from the other candidates in this race?
You know, I think that I stand out because I stand for justice for all. I have never treated someone inappropriately, whether that was in the practice of law, when I was teaching, in my personal life, and even when I was a hearing examiner. I have always tried to do the right thing, and I believe that people want someone that has a broad background, that they're going to understand the types of law that come before that court. And I'm one of those candidates that do have that broad background, not only in the criminal cases, but in the civil cases. And I have issued decisions. So I understand what it takes to make sure that those opinions are done correctly, so that you're not going to have many appeals from the decisions that you make. Because if you do it right the first time, the parties are going to, feel that they had their day in court and that the judge treated them fairly. You know, there's a decision always on one side or the other when you're a judge. But the one thing I found, even when I was a mediator, I was one of the top mediators for the Commonwealth, which most people don't even have that experience when they're running for judge. And I settled almost all my cases. In fact, I settled all of them except for one successfully. And that's very important, because that's a skill that we don't talk about much as a judge. They say you have to have good communication skills. Well, what does that mean? Well, you have to have excellent writing skills. You have to communicate well. You have to have excellent interpersonal skills, because you're dealing with not only people before you, but with your colleagues, with your chambers and those that work for you. But the one skill that's overlooked so much is listening. And as a mediator, again, you're impartial. You're not taking one side over the other. You're listening to the parties. You're trying to determine, are there issues that can be resolved, so it doesn't have to be litigated and go on and cost a lot of money for both parties. It's emotionally draining. And can we come to some conclusion? And I think the one person had said to me when I was a mediator, and I heard this again when I was a hearing examiner, is, Maria, you're a good listener. You know, I know that you didn't agree with me in this case, in the hearing, not a mediation, because you settle it. But you listened to me. I felt that I was heard. And even though you ultimately decided the other way, I felt that you gave me a fair chance. And those gentlemen that I talked about last time on my travels, they said, keep politics out of the courtroom. And people feel that politics, in some instances, is in the courtroom. And so we have to make sure that the actions of a few do not impede the ability to have trust and belief in our judicial system. And that's in every profession. It's not just the judicial system. It's people have to trust and believe that the judges on our courts are going to do what's right every single time.
What are some concerns that people are telling you they have while you're out on the campaign trail?
You know, the concerns they have are so broad. They believe that sometimes in our political process that people are sometimes selected for them, and they're not getting the options that they want in terms of not only issues when it deals with the legislature, but in terms of candidates. And so I think that my candidacy is refreshing to many. I was very well received the last time. And, people don't understand that it's really, really hard to run statewide. It takes a lot of courage to do that. And I almost won last time. I only lost by 1.39% statewide. And I was the highest vote getter for the Superior Court of 4 candidates with 2 seats. In fact, if you think about our state, and I had a map, it's in my car, I wish I would have brought it in. I came in first place in 52 of 67 counties with 4 candidates. And then someone says, well, how did you lose? I mean, how did you lose when you came in first place in 52 of 67 counties? And so those 13 counties where I came in third place behind 2 Democrats, they are predominantly, areas that, there's a larger population. The 52 counties are more of the counties that have smaller populations. But at the polls, I was first place. I had over 1,100,000 votes. In that race, it was the mail-in ballots. I had about 178,000 mail-in ballots to the 2 candidates that are now sitting on the Superior Court, and they had over 600 and over 500,000 mail-in ballots. We recently saw the same issue in the special election for a Senate seat in Lancaster. And so people have to get out there and vote. They believe sometimes that their vote doesn't count, but it does matter. 1.39% is less than 1,200 votes per county. And so this is election after presidential, where we had record numbers of people coming out last time. We had people in the 80%, 90% of people turning out to vote. That is significant, And so what's the average percentage in a municipal race, which they call an off-year election, which I wish they didn't use that term, because the judicial races are always in these type of in those municipal races. And, electing the right people to the courts is so important because it's a 10-year term. But people need to come out and vote. It's less than 34%. Some counties are as low as 26 or 27%. And that makes a big difference on who will be elected ultimately in November, because people decide in the primary who the 2 candidates are going to be. So I think that's very, very important.
Lastly, take the last couple minutes to tell the people of Pennsylvania why they should vote for you.
I am a person of the people and for the people, and by the people who have the ability and the power to elect the right people to the bench and to the Superior Court and the Commonwealth Court for that matter. And I think it's important that you not only look at someone's background in their legal career, but get to know them as a person, because that really tells the full story of who they are. I talked about who is Maria, and Maria is a person that's always stood by what was right. Even as a young child, when I was wanting to play boys Little League, and it seems so simple, but it's an important principle. I stood up for what was right because I was a very, very good baseball player, and I was very small. And I was placed on a team to play Little League, and now girls are in Little League all the time. But I was a barrier breaker, as one chair said, and I did what was right, and I set a path for other women to follow. And there have been women before me in the courts that have been my mentors, my trainers, and believed in me and my capabilities. And I hope you, the people, will know that should you elect me to the Superior Court, that I will do what's right every single time. I will use not only my educational background, but my experiences not to change an outcome, because I would never use my own personal preferences, but I would use my experiences and understanding of the law to apply it appropriately and make sure that the facts in every single case are evaluated appropriately with no prejudgments, and that if there's a constitutional issue, I would address it appropriately as well, as it's intended by our founders. And I would certainly appreciate your vote on May 20th.
Maria Battista, Republican for Pennsylvania Superior Court, thank you for your time.
And thank you for this opportunity so much.